The notification came at 2047 in the morning. I wasn't supposed to see it. I had been asleep for hours, or at least I thought I had been. Some part of my brain had been running a background process for weeks by then. Something quiet and persistent that wouldn't let me fully rest. So when the soft blue glow of my phone lit up the ceiling of our bedroom, I was awake before the sound even registered. It was a location alert, one I had set up myself, 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon while my wife was at her spin class. Sitting at my desk in the home office she always complained was too cluttered. I work in network infrastructure, have for 18 years, so setting up a shared location ping on our phone took me about 4 minutes. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. I set the alert for any location movement after midnight, and then I tried very hard to forget I had done it. The notification said her phone was at the Meridian Suites on Caldwell Boulevard. She was supposed to be in Columbus. She had left that afternoon for what she called a regional conference. She had showed me the registration email, the hotel confirmation, the agenda printed out on company letterhead. My wife, I'll call her Sandra, had been thorough. She always was. Sandra was a regional director for a mid-size healthcare consulting firm, and she was meticulous about everything she did. That should have been the first sign, honestly. People who are cheating don't get sloppy. They get organized. The Meridian Suites was 11 miles from our house. I lay there in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of our dog shifting on the floor beside the bed. My daughter, she was 17 at the time, a junior in high school, was asleep down the hall. My son was away at his first year of college. It was just the three of us in the house, and the house felt very large and very quiet. I didn't call Sandra. I didn't drive to the hotel. I did what I always do when something breaks. I started documenting. I had suspected something was wrong for about 2 months before that night. It started with small things that a person who didn't pay attention would have missed. Sandra had always been someone who left her phone face up on the kitchen counter. Then one evening in September, I noticed it was face down. A week later, she had added a new pin. She had always used our anniversary. I only found out it had changed when I tried to borrow her phone to look up a restaurant, and it didn't work. She laughed it off. Said she had changed it for security after some breach at work. I let it go. Then came the gym schedule changes. She had been going to the same Tuesday-Thursday spin class for 3 years. Suddenly, she was adding Saturday mornings, then Wednesday evenings. She came home flushed and energized in a way that I told myself was just fitness, just the endorphins, just my wife finally finding something she was passionate about. I wanted to believe that. I worked very hard at believing it. What I couldn't explain away was the trip to Columbus. She had taken 4 of them in 6 weeks, all Thursday through Saturday, all tied to regional meetings that her company apparently scheduled with unusual regularity. I had looked up her company's event calendar online. It was publicly listed on their website, and I found exactly 1 regional event in that time frame. 1. The others weren't there. So 3 weeks before that notification, I had set the location alert, and now her phone was at a hotel 11 miles away. I got up carefully, went to my office, closed the door, and sat in the dark for a while. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the location history I had been quietly archiving. Not just the alert, the full log. Every Thursday to Saturday for 6 weeks, her phone had gone to Columbus. The coordinates matched the hotel she had confirmed. But looking more carefully at the timestamps, I noticed something I had missed before. On 2 of those trips, the phone had spent Friday night somewhere else entirely, not Columbus, not home. A different location that I had not looked up yet because I hadn't wanted to look it up. I looked it up now. It was an address in a residential neighborhood about 20 minutes from our house. I put it into the county property records database, which is public and takes about 30 seconds to search if you know where to look. The property was registered to a man I'll call Marcus Webb. I did not know anyone named Marcus Webb. I sat with that name for a few minutes. Then I did what anyone with 18 years of IT experience does when they need to find out about a person. I started pulling threads. Marcus Webb, 44 years old. Married, 2 kids. Lived in the house where Sandra's phone had spent 2 Friday nights. He worked in healthcare administration, same industry as Sandra. Not the same company, but the kind of adjacent orbit where people meet at regional events. at industry conferences, at the spin classes that healthcare professionals apparently all attend. I did not sleep the rest of that night. What I did instead was make a decision about how I was going to handle this. I had seen the other version. I knew men who had confronted their wives in the heat of the moment, who had called lawyers while still shaking, who had screamed and thrown things and blown up their lives in 48 hours. Some of them came out okay. A lot of them didn't. They tipped their hand before they had the cards they needed. They gave their wives time to prepare, to move money, to craft a narrative. I was not going to do that. I was going to be patient. I was going to be surgical. And I was going to make absolutely sure that when everything came apart, it came apart on my terms. The next morning, I made my wife breakfast. I kissed her on the cheek when she came downstairs. I asked about Columbus, and she told me about a dinner she'd had with colleagues and a session on compliance reporting that had run long. She was a good liar. She had the kind of face that stayed calm when she needed it to. I watched her hands while she talked, and they didn't move any more than usual. And I thought about how long she must have been practicing. My daughter came down for breakfast too, and I watched the two of them talk about her college application essays, and I felt something crack somewhere in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. I spent the next 2 weeks building my case. I am not going to pretend this was a righteous process. There is nothing clean about confirming your marriage is a lie. I hired a private investigator, a woman who came recommended through a friend of a friend, worked mostly domestic cases, charged a flat rate for a 2-week engagement. I want to be clear about this, because I think it matters. I did not sneak around trying to catch my wife in bed. I asked a professional to document what was happening and to do it in a way that would hold up. She gave me photographs, timestamps, locations that matched my own records. Everything clean, everything legal, everything documented. What the investigator found was that Marcus Webb and my wife had been seeing each other for somewhere between 8 and 10 months. The Thursday conferences were real. Sandra did attend them, but she was extending her stays. She was also meeting Marcus on 2 evenings a week locally, always during the hours she had carved out with the new gym schedule. The investigator also found something I had not asked her to look for. She called me on a Wednesday morning and said she needed to meet in person. I drove to her office on my lunch break. She had a folder on her desk and she didn't open it right away. She asked me if I was doing okay, which is not a question investigators usually ask. Then she told me she had found something, while cross-referencing location data, that I should probably know about before deciding how to proceed. Marcus Webb was not only seeing my wife, he was also seeing my sister. I need you to understand what that sentence felt like to hear. My sister, I'll call her Diane, is 40 years old. She had been divorced for 2 years after a marriage that had cost her a lot. She had started rebuilding. She had seemed happier recently, lighter, the way people look when something good is happening and they haven't told anyone yet. I had noticed it and been glad for her. She hadn't said anything about a new relationship, but Diane had always been private. I hadn't pushed. The investigator showed me the documentation, same man, different days of the week, a pattern that fit together with the kind of precision that makes you understand exactly how much planning had gone into it. I sat in that office for a long time. Marcus Webb had apparently decided that having an affair with one member of my family was not enough. I drove home on autopilot. I don't remember the route. I remember parking in our driveway and sitting in the car and thinking about Diane, about what this would do to her, about the fact that she didn't know, about the fact that she was building something with a man who was simultaneously building the same thing with her brother's wife. I thought about whether she would believe me when I told her. I thought about whether she would be angry at me for telling her. Then I thought about what she would feel when she found out I had known and hadn't said anything. I called her that night. I asked if I could come over Sunday afternoon. She said sure, sounded happy. I said I'd bring lunch. Before Sunday, I needed to have everything in order. Here's what I did, and I want to walk through it carefully because I think the details matter. I went back to every piece of documentation I had. I organized it chronologically. I scanned everything and saved encrypted copies in 3 separate cloud locations. I wrote a clear, factual summary of what I knew and when I had found it out, signed and dated. Then I called a family law attorney. Not someone Sandra knew, not someone from our social circle, someone my investigator recommended, and I scheduled a consultation for Friday morning. The attorney asked me what outcome I was looking for. I told her I wanted to be protected financially. I wanted documentation of the affair for the purposes of any asset division dispute, and I wanted the process to be as contained as possible until I was ready. She told me what I could and couldn't use, what was admissible, what I needed to be careful about. We talked for 90 minutes. I left with a clear picture of where I stood legally. I was in a better position than I had expected. We had a prenuptial agreement. Sandra had actually insisted on it, which I had always taken as a sign of practicality and which I now understood differently. But the agreement had a fidelity clause. She had not thought I would ever have documentation. I went to see Diane on Sunday. I brought sandwiches from the deli she liked. We sat at her kitchen table, and I watched her face for a while, and then I asked if she had been seeing anyone. She got a small, careful smile and said maybe. I asked his name. She told me. Marcus. I told her I needed to show her something. I don't want to describe in too much detail what happened in the next half hour. Diane is not someone who falls apart easily. She never has been. But I watched something go out of her eyes that afternoon that I hope never happens to anyone I love again. She looked at the photographs. She looked at the dates. She was very quiet. At one point she got up and went to the sink and ran the water for a while, and I sat at the table and didn't say anything. When she came back, she asked me 2 questions. She asked if Sandra knew about her, and she asked if he was still seeing both of them. I told her yes to both. She sat down again and was quiet for another long moment. Then she looked at me and said, "What are you going to do?" I told her I had a plan. I told her I wanted her to be part of it if she was willing. I told her I didn't want her to confront him yet. Didn't want her to tip him off that anything had changed. I told her I just needed a few more days and then we were going to end this the right way. Diane is a paralegal. She has been one for 12 years. She knows more about documentation and process than most people give her credit for. She looked at me for a long moment and then she said, "Tell me exactly what you need." Here's what we needed. Marcus Webb's wife, I'll call her Patrice, did not know about either of our situations. She was running a household, raising 2 children, working a part-time job. She had no idea her husband had constructed a second and third life around her schedule. She deserved to know. But more than that, she deserved to know in a way that wasn't devastating without also being actionable. Diane and I agreed on the following. We would not show up at Patrice's door. We would not send anonymous letters. We would do what should always be done in situations like this. We would let the documentation speak for itself, through the appropriate channels in a way that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Diane drafted a letter. She's good at that. Clear, professional, no unnecessary emotion. Just facts, dates, locations, documentation attached. She wrote it the way she writes legal correspondence. We had it notarized. We sent a copy to Patrice by certified mail. We kept a copy for our own records. I had already started the divorce process the week before. My attorney had filed the initial paperwork on Thursday. Sandra didn't know yet. She found out on a Tuesday evening. I had asked her to sit down in the living room. I had the folder on the coffee table between us. I told her I needed to talk to her about something serious. She looked at the folder and something shifted in her face. Not guilt exactly, more like a recalculation. The look of someone who is suddenly running numbers. She reached for the folder and I let her take it. I watched her go through it. I watched her face move through several stages. She stopped on one of the photographs for a long time. Then she set the folder down carefully on the table, which is very Sandra, and she looked at me and said, "How long have you known?" I told her long enough. She didn't cry. I had half expected her to cry or to get angry or to do what some people do, which is start justifying everything immediately. She didn't do any of those things. She asked if I had already talked to a lawyer. I told her yes. She asked if she could have until the weekend before anything was served formally. I told her the papers had already been filed. Something finally broke in her face then. Not remorse, I don't think. More like the specific devastation of realizing that the plan you had been running quietly for months had already been outmaneuvered. She moved out the following weekend. Her mother came to help her pack. I took my daughter out to lunch while it happened because my daughter did not need to watch that, and we sat at a diner 3 miles away and she asked me questions I answered as honestly as I could without giving her more than she needed to carry. My daughter handled it better than I did, honestly. She was hurt and she was angry in ways she didn't always know how to express. But she was also 17 years old and fundamentally resilient in a way that made me proud even when it made me sad. She asked me once, a few weeks later, if I had seen it coming. I told her I had suspected something for a while. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Dad, you should have trusted your gut sooner." She wasn't wrong. Patrice reached out to me about 2 weeks after we sent the letter. She called from a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't pick up. She was composed in a way that told me she had been holding herself together by force of will. She thanked me for telling her. She said she had already retained an attorney. She said Marcus had moved out at the house. She did not ask me for details about Sandra specifically, and I appreciated that. What she did ask was whether I knew how long it had been going on. I told her what my investigator had found 8 to 10 months. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want you to know I'm sorry about your wife and your sister." She said it simply, without any performance in it, and I believed her. We talked a few more times over the following months. Not often. There wasn't much to say, and we were both in the middle of rebuilding, but there was something clarifying about those conversations, about talking to someone who understood the specific geometry of what had happened to our families without needing it explained. Sandra and I finalized the divorce 8 months later. The fidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement held, my attorney was thorough. The settlement was not painless, it never is, but I was not left with nothing. The house was mine. We had built equity over 14 years, and I had made sure that was documented and protected. Marcus's situation resolved itself with less order and more noise. Patrice's divorce was contested in ways mine wasn't. And from what I understood secondhand, it got complicated and expensive. He kept his job, which I won't pretend didn't frustrate me. But people like Marcus generally do keep their jobs. The professional consequences of how you treat people outside of work rarely make it through the office door. That's one of those things I've had to make peace with. What I haven't made peace with, entirely, is what it costs my daughter. I want to be honest about this, because I think people tell these stories sometimes as if the aftermath is clean. It isn't. My daughter went from a 2-parent home to a 1-parent household in the span of a few months. She handled it better than I did in some ways and worse in others. She had a hard fall semester. She needed more from me than I always knew how to give. I am not a man who was trained to talk about feelings, and learning to do that better, learning to sit with my kid in her uncertainty and not immediately try to fix it, was harder than anything I did in the investigation, harder than any conversation with any lawyer. We got there, slowly, with a therapist she liked, and I eventually went to see separately myself, which is something I would not have done 3 years ago, and which I am glad I did. My son took it harder in some ways because he found out at a distance and didn't have the context that proximity provides. He came home for winter break and I told him everything, face to face, and we sat in the kitchen for a long time not talking. He's 20 now. He's doing well. He asks about me more than he used to, which I think is his version of checking on me. Diane and Patrice ended up meeting once, about a year after everything fell apart. Diane's idea. She said she felt like she needed to close the loop on something. I don't know exactly what was said. What Diane told me afterward was that they had coffee for about 2 hours, and that Patrice was sharper and funnier than she had expected, and that she was glad she had gone. I think about the version of this story where I never set that location alert, where I kept telling myself I was paranoid, where I let things run another year or two, or until Sandra decided she was ready to leave on her own terms. That version exists. A lot of men live it. I understand why. There's a part of the brain that would rather not know, that will accept any explanation over the one that means everything has to change. I was not patient with that part of my brain in the end, and I don't regret it. What I do think about sometimes, in ways I'm still not sure I've fully processed, is the question of what you don't see. I spent 18 years building what I thought was a shared life with someone. I knew her habits and her preferences, and the particular way she ordered at restaurants, and the things that made her laugh. I thought I knew her. And I did know those things. I wasn't wrong about all of it, but there was a version of her that had been running parallel to the one I knew, and I don't know how long it had been there. And I don't know if I missed signs earlier than the ones I caught. And I probably never will. You can document the facts. You can build a clean timeline and protect yourself legally and make sure that when everything comes out, you're standing on solid ground. What you can't fully prepare for is the work of reconstructing who you are once the person you organized your life around turns out to have been someone else. I'm still doing that work. Some days it goes better than others. I am employed, solvent, and present in my kids' lives in ways I'm proud of. I have a dog who is 11 years old and deeply unreasonable. I have a sister who calls me more often than she used to, and a house that is quieter than it once was, and a very good therapist. I am not the man I was 3 years ago, and I've stopped deciding whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just the thing that happened. You find the information, you protect yourself and the people you love, you do the work, and then you get up and keep going. That's what I know how to tell you.